Welcome, and welcome to this Halloween special. It's Halloween week. This special of the Gothic Women project, and our big focus tonight will be, today, wherever you are, will be ghost stories. Got three fantastic speakers lined up. We'll pop a link in the chat to the Gothic Women project. The larger name of the project is 2023, the Year of Gothic Women. We're leading up to a large gathering in 2023 in celebration of various anniversaries related to Mary Shelley and also Anne Radcliffe as well. But the broad aim of the project is to find out more and to celebrate Gothic women in the 19th century, find connections with modern day as well. It's a critical project, but also a creative project in many ways. I'll introduce you to the team. They're going to give us a lovely wave now, and I'm just going to focus where my eye takes me. Anna Mercer here, give us a wave, Anna. I'm based at Cardiff University. And then we have Deborah Russell, will give us a wave here, based at and she's a senior lecturer at the University of York in the UK. And then we have Laura Kirkley, based at a lecturer based at the University of Newcastle in England, and Lauren Nixon, who is our moderator. And thank you to the British Association for Romantic Studies, who funds Lauren's involvement in the project as our engagement fellow. In the chat then, Lauren's popped a link to the website, so you can learn more about the project. Also, please do engage with our social media, hashtag Gothic Women, capital G, capital W. And as you know, the event is being recorded. We're going to have questions at the end. To signal that you would like to ask a question, please type the letter Q and then a colon, and that will signal to us that you would like to ask a question. Feel free to use the chat function to respond in a very positive and constructive way to all our talks. And if you have any questions about some of the material raised, we can provide that for you. My name is Daniel Cook. I'm based at the University of Dundee in Scotland, and it's just a great privilege to be part of this project. This is the third event we've had so far. We kicked off on Mary Shelley's birthday with a wonderful event celebrating Mary Shelley's other works. We love Frankenstein, we also love the other Shelley works as well. And then we had a wonderful event last month, this October. Today, we're focusing on Gothic stories, and we've got many more events to come into 2022, taking us right up to 2023 as well. And a great question has come in from Susan Brady. Do you have any suggestions for ways younger students, high school age, can get involved in the 2023 project? Delighted that you said that, Susan, because that's one aspect we're really quite keen to look at, is the ways in which Gothic literature by women is taught in schools and beyond the academy broadly. So we're very interested in that project, and Deborah's popped a link to us, get in touch, and we've got some suggestions, got some thoughts. We're going to put together some teaching materials as well. We're fascinated with the idea that schools don't seem to be teaching a sufficient amount of literature by Gothic women, and that's part of our aims, if you like. I think that's it in terms of welcomes. So I'm going to bring in our speakers at this stage. At this point, please, for the purposes of broadband, please do turn off your cameras now, just so we can focus on our speakers. If you haven't yet done so, you might want to turn the speaker view function on, which you can find at the top middle of your screen. So at this stage, I'll invite you now, please turn off your cameras. We'll invite you to turn them back on at the end after the three speakers, so we can see your faces again, and we can get into some queries. Let's turn to our first speaker then. Our first speaker, great delight to welcome Dr. Emma Liggins, who is a reader in 19th century studies at Manchester Metropolitan University. She has published articles and book chapters on the Victorian supernatural, the modernist ghost story, and the new woman. Her recent books include Odd Women, Spinsters, Lesbians, and Widows in British Women's Fiction, 1850s to 1930s, published by Manchester University Press in 2014, and The Haunted House in Women's Ghost Stories, 1850 to 1940, Gender, Space, and Modernity, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020. She is currently editing 2 special editions of women's writing on ghost stories, spiritualism, and the supernatural, and writing about Susan Hill's The Woman in Black for a collection on graveyard Gothic. Let's hand over now to Emma.
Hi everyone, great to see you all here, and thanks for coming on an October Monday night. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be part of this Gothic Women project. I'm really looking forward to the other papers here today as well. So I'll just share my screen and hope that this is now working. Okay. Can you see that okay?
Perfect, thank you, Emma.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite ghost story writers from the end of the 19th century called Lettice Galbraith. And I've discovered her fairly recently in some of my research on women's ghost stories and some of my editing work. So I'm going to be thinking a little bit about how she represents forsaken women in her 1890s ghost stories. So I wanted to start off by thinking a little bit about some of these ideas of what might be meant by the broader implications of Gothic women, or to turn that around, the idea of women's Gothic. So I'm going to start with a couple of critical quotations here. Gothic flying past my face there. Emma Cleary says, what happens if we lay aside our assumptions about women's writing and look again at women's Gothic? What we find there suggests the need for another story: wild passions, the sublime, supernatural phenomena, violent conflict, murder and torture, sexual excess and perversion, outlandish settings, strange minglings of history and fantasy. So I'm really fascinated by how women writers choose to produce their Gothic texts and what elements they include, what settings, how they use the supernatural, what excessive formulations they find. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I approach women's ghost stories as we go along. In the introduction to another great recent collection called Women in the Gothic, Avril Horner and Suze Losnick say, Gothic texts still frequently convey anxiety and anger about the lot of women. Many reflect women's lack of agency and a continued use of stereotypes. On the other hand, the use of Gothic effects to celebrate transgressive female energy and iconoclasm is perhaps greater and more subtle now in 2016 than it was when Charlotte Zacher wrote Zafloya in the early 19th century. So they're suggesting those kind of conflicts that go on within women's Gothic, the anxiety and anger about the lot of women, fears that women are not demonstrating their agency, but also the facts that women Gothic authors are trying to challenge some of those ideas perhaps, and perhaps they're trying to celebrate female transgression. You can see from this array of famous figures on the slide here that there are lots of different forms of women's Gothic across the centuries. But if we're thinking about the long 19th century, we might wonder about the different kinds of Gothic heroines and transgressive women that might appear in these texts. So to start with Lettice Galbraith, I don't know very much about her, I have to say, which I don't usually say in relation to the women writers that I research. This is a probable pseudonym for Elle or Lettice Gibson, according to other editors like Richard Dolby. She produced ghost stories in the 1890s, this collection here, New Ghost Stories, and a novel called The Spin of the Coin, and also another story called The Blue Room, which appeared in Macmillan's magazine. So in this paper, I'm going to talk mainly about her stories in the Seance Room and The Missing Model. In the Seance Room seems to be one of her more well-known stories, because that one's been a little bit more frequently anthologized. She was publishing alongside other writers of the 1890s, like Louisa Baldwin, pictured here, E. Nesbit, Vernon Lee. So she's tapping into some of these sort of common interests in the supernatural and the idea of gendering the supernatural that you have in the 1890s. She's also been located in relation to discussions of women's weird by Melissa Edmondson, and I'll say a little bit more about that as I carry on. I'm interested in how she might fit into ways of thinking about this notion of gendering the supernatural. Victoria Margry, in her recent book on women's short supernatural fiction, says that women's ghost stories repeatedly stage scenarios of women's silencing and exclusion. And this is something to bear in mind when analysing the woman's ghost story. How might that silencing and exclusion be combated or challenged in the ghost story? Where does this ghost story take place, and do some of the spaces of the ghost story allow for more agency for women? In the 1890s, we have these influences taking place, these generic strains feeding into the ghost story. By this time, at the end of the 19th century, ghost story collections have become a lot more popular. We have the rise of the psychological ghost story, where maybe the phantom figure there is a manifestation of psychological drives or fantasies, very much linked to sort of new Freudian understandings of repression. We have crossovers with crime fiction, and there's been some really interesting work on that recently by figures like Claire Clark, who's talked about this shared tropes of the crime story and the ghost story. So you have the foggy London street, fake identities, newspaper reports, scandals, suicide and murder. So in the era of Sherlock Holmes, the ghost story kind of gathers these new fascinations with criminality and the urban space. It's also the era of the new woman, so you might expect to see stronger female heroines in writing of this time, women who are trying to articulate their rebellious urges. Looking forward to the Edwardian supernatural, we have more of an interest in black magic, in summoning up demons, and we also have the origins of women's weird, perhaps something that's dated towards often the beginnings of the 20th century, but critics like Melissa Edmondson have suggested we can very much see this beginning around this time. She talks about women's contributions to the weird mode, complicating existing notions of the supernatural, of spectres becoming more varied as a result of living in the modern world. And if you're not familiar with this weird mode, it's kind of suggesting very much this strangeness of the modern. The phantom takes on new characteristics. You have strange things, strange creatures or blobs appearing in some of these stories. And sometimes it's very difficult to spot the actual phantom figure themselves. Maybe they're just some kind of strange entity, a kind of atmosphere or feeling, so that what it means to be haunted is perhaps changing by this time. Sorry, this is too sensitive. So I think about Galbraith's stories in relation to new understandings of the occult at this time. I think that's a useful framework for her work that fits in with new ways of thinking about magic and modernity at the fin de siècle. In her book, Pamela Thirschwell talks about this new fascination with the occult. She says occult ways of imagining cultural transmission and communication, which organisations such as the SPR are attempting to make scientifically plausible, are used by writers to create phantasmatic spaces in which they redefine intimate sexual, familial and national ties between people. against the usual patriarchal models of inheritance and community via marriage and the nuclear family. That became rather a long sentence, I think, there. So she's talking about this idea of the phantasmatic space at this time, this new space which might generate new means of communication, perhaps, in an era of kind of technological advance. The Society for Psychical Research, formed in the 1880s, which was investigating haunted houses and poltergeists and strange phenomena, sort of developed alongside this interest in new technologies, new fascination with telepathy, spiritualism. So these sort of new ways of examining communication feed into the ghost story. Christine Ferguson talks about the unbalancing of the opposition between science and esotericism, saying that at this time, the boundary between scientific and occult investigation was a distinctly porous one, that scientists believed in the supernatural or half believed, and occultists also claimed for their beliefs scientific authority. So there's some really fascinating kind of undercurrents behind the supernatural story at this time. And scientists often appear in these stories. In The Blue Room, Galbraith's 1897 story, which is a great story about the calling up of an incubus in a guest room of an ancestral home, which I don't have very much time to talk about today. One of the psychic investigators says it's almost past belief that such a thing could happen at the end of the 19th century in these scientific, rationalistic times that we think such a lot about. So always announcing the fact that how can ghosts appear in these kind of scientific, rationalistic ages. Spiritualism is a key context that women writers drew on in the 1890s, and there's been some really interesting feminist discussions about the seance room and about spiritualism as a countercultural movement at this time. Often in the stories, it's represented as both potentially fraudulent or tricking, but also as a kind of occult intervention. This is something that Tatiana Contu has talked about in her work. She talks about the thrilling and unsettling ambiguity of the seance, the darkened room with its shadows, the interplay between desire, fantasy, and reality. And I've been really interested to think about how ghost story writers, particularly women, might have been writing stories about seances at this time. I was surprised to find there actually weren't as many as I imagined. There's a really fascinating one by Agatha Christie from the 1920s called The Last Seance that you might want to look up. And May Sinclair is talking about the medium figure in The Floor in the Crystal from 1912. But so far, I haven't discovered a great many from the 1890s, which is why I was really interested in Galbraith's seance story and what that might suggest. So I'll just give you a few highlights of a couple of her stories so you can see how she tries to represent the supernatural and how she might link in with ideas of female agency. So quick plot summary there. It's a story about the doctor, Dr. Valentine Burke, who has a successful career and wealthy marriage, but this is challenged by the reappearance of a past lover. After he hypnotizes her, Kitty seems to acquiesce in her own drowning, but her spirit is called up in the seance scene at the center of the story, where she brings up notions of the doctor's guilt. And at the end of the story, his new wife, Elma, hypnotizes her sleeping husband in order to extract Kitty's lost story. So in this narrative, ideas of silencing and storytelling are brought into play. We're initially given access to some of Kitty's story, but we see how she is overpowered by this dangerous doctor figure who acts like a Svengali, like hypnotizing villain. The spurned woman operates as a ghostly presence in the story. She seems to be practically dead even before she's drowned. She's someone who's darkened by poverty and disgrace. She's someone who's threatening that power of the doctor figure, who's such a significant figure in 1890s Gothic. So this is a section from the seance scene here, which takes place at the house of Madame Delphine, who's a medium of extraordinary power. And this is 4 years after the death of Kitty, the central character, and all the characters are brought together in this scene. You can see that it's described in terms of the failure of masculine nerve from the opening of the passage here. His nerve was deserting him as the sudden silence falls on the room. Mrs. Burke shivered from head to foot and drew close to her husband. After a shriek of horror issuing from the lips of the medium, who is crouching terror-stricken in the centre of the scene, the presence which had appeared before the black curtain was no white-clad denizen of Summerland, but a woman in dark, clinging garments, a woman with wide-open, glassy eyes, fixed in an unalterable, stony stare. Of the 20 people who looked upon it, not one had power to move or speak. Slowly, the terrible thing glided forwards, hardly touching the ground, one hand outstretched, and on the open palm, a small glittering object, a diamond ring. So this is the key scene in terms of the woman returning to tell her story. She has already attempted her narrative by sending a spectral letter accusing Dr. Burke of murdering her. But here she passes an object across the border between life and death, which is quite a kind of a weird occurrence in the story. The ring is a present to his new fiancée. She's described as a terrible thing, that idea of the uncertain thing that you get in women's weird. She's a woman in black who also has these wide opened glassy eyes with the unalterable stony stare. So drawing on the notions of hypnotism, which also lurk behind the story. Hypnotism is another key context for the 1890s ghost story that women were really fascinated by, I think, in terms of its ideas about power and control. And you can probably think of other examples of 1890s Gothic fiction, like The Beetle or Trilby, which use ideas of mesmerism. Susan Posner in her articles suggests that mesmerism isn't usually directly represented in Gothic writing, that we don't always have these explicit scenes, maybe because writers thought that it was linked with figurative sexual violation. But actually, this isn't really the case in relation to this story. We have already seen a mesmeric scene earlier on, before that seance scene. Burke and Kitty's eyes meet in that fixed stare, his cold, steady, dominating, and hers flinching and striving to withstand the power of the stronger will. And she is overpowered and died. Whereas by the end of the story, his wife successfully hypnotizes him in order to get Kitty's narrative, using against him a power which you yourself had taught me, she says. I'm interested how Galbraith seems to be drawing ideas from what she may have read about mediums or spiritualist performances. The medium Chandos Leigh Hunt, who's pictured here, who was known for her mesmeric performances in the 80s, talks about the great powers of mental concentration required for the piercing magnetic gaze. And that magnetic gaze often appears in these stories. So the dead Kitty, the undead Kitty who returns in the seance, uses her magnetic gaze to subdue the doctor in public, and the other figures are watching in that scene. At the end of the story, he commits suicide after being hypnotized by his wife. So there's like that combined power of the women within the story, which perhaps suggests that they can acquire an agency, however limited that might be. And Indu Ori has talked about this in her interesting article about Galbraith. where she talks about the differences between male and female manipulation of the supernatural, saying that Galbraith is exposing the arrogance and hypocrisy of psychical researchers who claim to exercise rationality in evaluating the occult. And this is my final slide now, just a couple of observations about the second story in Galbraith's collection that I've looked at, called The Missing Model, where Violet Lucas, who is another woman who's vanished off the face of the earth, one of these silent women, returns as a spirit to occupy the artist's studio and the public art gallery. Like another model in the story, she's returning to draw attention to her own murder. At the end of the story, her skeleton is discovered buried beneath the cellar floor in a suburban villa. She's been seduced, we imagine, and become the mistress of an Australian millionaire who enjoys art. And this model is described in the story in terms of her supernatural, her superhuman powers, her powers of endurance, which make her into a strange figure. So painting her becomes like an introduction into a new and unknown world. She's like the darker side of the artist model who appears in quite a lot of 1890s stories. She poses for the figure of Oenone, who's shown in this image here, who was the first wife of Paris in Greek mythology, another abandoned woman who fits in with this figure here. And she's often shown behind curtains, behind veils, crossing boundaries, a very ghostly kind of threshold figure in the story. And this is signaling the unveiling of her story that needs to be voiced as the narrative continues. So she slips into the artist's studio from the darkness, where we're shown that she exercises a magnetic influence on the artist's figure. She remains surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery. She disappears when visitors arrive. So like Kitty in the previous story, they cross the thresholds into male space and then make their stories known. When she appears in the artist's studio, the men are drawn to the suburban villa where they discover the skeleton under the floor, and they're able to unearth her story there. So that kind of magnetic gaze of the woman, her eyes are very much discussed in the story, and lure the men towards her burial scene. Again, seems to tap into some of the ideas about spiritualism, gender and power from the period. And it's also kind of drawing on some of those tropes of the crime narrative that I mentioned earlier on. The detectives are on the murder trail. So Galbraith's version of women's Gothic, just to conclude, is interested in ideas of the agency that the supernatural woman can achieve, the way in which she can kind of draw men to her story through her magnetic gaze. These women come back from the dead for revelation rather than consolation. And those excluded women in the seance room and the art gallery silently petition for their lost stories to be told. So maybe this is a way for Galbraith to overturn those ideas about silencing and exclusion that might hem women in within the Gothic texts, the ways in which they appropriate magnetic power or the resistance to their loss of control under hypnotism act as some kind of challenging of male authority and knowledge. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm just trying to find the reaction button. At the bottom of Zoom, everyone, you'll find the reaction button, hand clappy gesture. I'm sure there's a comment to be made about Zoom and seance, but I can't quite make that connection. We'll do that collectively, I think. And just as a reminder, everyone, we'll have the questions at the end. But if you want to remind yourself and signal to us you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat function, as Alice has done here, with the letter Q, colon, and that will signal to us that you want to make pose a question. We welcome, of course, general comments as well. Great, so we'll turn to our second speaker now. Oh, Laura Kirklees nailed the joke, perfect. Can you hear me? Is anyone there? Fantastic. There'll be so many questions, I think, for you, Emma, later about genre, authorship, appropriation, the supernatural woman as storyteller. I really enjoyed that so much. Let's turn to our second speaker then. Our second speaker is Dr. Agnieska Łowczanin, who works in the Department of British Literature and Culture at the University of Lodz in Poland. She has written on novelists of the 18th and early 19th centuries, focusing especially on the politics and poetics of the Gothic. She co-edited 2 volumes of essays, All That Gothic in 2014 and Gothic Peregrinations 2019. I'm just trying to read the writing here, and is the author of A Dark Transfusion, the Polish literary response to early English Gothic, which was published in 2018. She's currently collaborating on an edited collection on Polish Gothic to be published in 2022. Great, thank you. I'll hand over to our speaker now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to confirm, can you hear me well?
Perfectly.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. And also, it's a pleasure to be speaking in such a great company. Emma and Kathleen are really great speakers. And well, thank you everyone for joining us here today. Thanks everyone in the audience. Today, I would like to talk about Anna Mostowska, who is the first author, the first female author of first published ghost stories in Polish. I would like to focus on 2 of her short stories to demonstrate how her supernatural evolved in her writing, and also to investigate what functions other than to offer pleasing terror to her readers the supernatural had in her stories. First of all, I would like to show you the part of Europe that I am going to be focusing on. This is Poland, Lithuania at the end of the 18th century. This is Mostowska's part of Europe that I will be referring to today. Now, because Anna Mostowska is an unknown author, she has not been translated into English. She is unknown to a majority of Polish readers because her stories were not reprinted for over 200 years. I would like to say just a few words to introduce her as a person, first of all, and also as a writer. So Anna Mostowska was Anne Radcliffe's contemporary. She was of aristocratic background. She was born into the Radziwiłłs, that is one of Lithuania's most influential families. She was born in Lithuania, but then moved with her second husband, Tadeusz Mostowski, to Warsaw. They lived in the capital of Poland, Lithuania, in the politically heady times of the 4 Years' Sejm, when the intellectuals and parliamentarians got together in order to reform the state. Their attempts failed. Poland, Lithuania, which had been in a union for over 400 years, at that time was divided between its neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and for over a century would disappear from the maps of Europe. Because of her husband's political activities, the couple had to flee Poland, traveling via Dresden to France, convulsed at that time by revolutionary turmoil. We know that at that time, Mostowski separated from his wife and he took on a lover, Rosalia Lubomicka, soon to be guillotined during the reign of terror in France, while Mostowska toured Europe on her own. It was most probably her travel that brought her into contact with English Gothic novels, the vogue of the day, which, written as they were and translated mostly by women, might have encouraged her to become a writer herself. Her marriage further deteriorated, the couple separated for good, and then divorced in 1804. Mostowska returned to Lithuania in 1802, an independent, emancipated, well-read woman with artistic and literary ambitions. In 1806, she published her first collection of short stories entitled Moje rozrywki, My Diversions, and in the preface she had the following passage, which I see as her artistic literary manifesto. Let's have a look at it. Madame de Lafayette, de Riccoboni, and a great number of authoresses and authors, the delight and diversion of former days, their works admired in the times of Louis XIV and read with pleasure, even with rapture, throughout a greater part of the 18th century, are worth remembering. But now they are, am I to reveal the truth, utterly boring. While our mothers may have been easily moved by the misfortunes of Clarissa, Pamela, etc., the exhausted feelings of our generation need more violent sensations. Dreadful specters, visitors from other worlds, tempests, earthquakes, ruins of ancient castles inhabited by ghosts only, packs of bandits armed with daggers and a traitor's poison, murder, prison, and finally, devils and witches. When all this is found together, only then do we have a romance fit for the taste of our age. So this is part of the introduction to the reader that precedes her first collection. However, immediately following this passage, in the same preface, Mostowska adopted a very apologetic tone. She begged her readers not to be too critical about her writing and to remember that she was just a woman who wrote her stories for her own pleasure. She finished the preface by assuring them that she never really aspired to become an authoress or believed her writing would see the light. In a letter to her publisher, she urged him not to place her name on the frontispiece and confessed she scribbled merely hoping to give amusement during family gatherings by the fireside. Now, Mostowska published her stories in Vilnius in the early decade of the 19th century. This was a decade immediately following the partitions of Poland, when the University of Vilnius became the center of Polish thought and culture, gathering many of the country's enlightened minds, intellectuals who were classicists and leading reformers of education during the Polish Enlightenment of the previous decades. Intellectuals in Vilnius at that time inherited the ideas of the educational mission of literature and were very hostile to novelties. Just to give you an insight into the atmosphere, let me quote from Jan Śniadecki, a mathematician, philosopher, and rector of the Vilnius University at that time, who in 1819 commented on the arrival of the new romantic craze in literature as follows: "Magic, witchcraft, and ghouls are not natural. They are the fruit of a mind debased by ignorance and superstition. They are the nonsense of peoples plunged into barbarity and unenlightened by the purity of religion." Over a decade later, in 1832, that is after the debut of the first Polish romantics, whose work was saturated with the supernatural and with folklore, Ludwik Osiński, a Polish literary critic, would comment on the arrival of subversive romantic energies, saying, "We should use every possible means to divert this plague. It is worse than cholera." Part of the social and intellectual milieu when she published her first collection, Mostowska knew very well she would come under severe criticism. Before her first volume came out, she not only shared with her publisher her fear of the critics, but also complained of fever and toothaches. Publication of the first volume obviously gave her very strong somatic symptoms, because stories in this first collection were ghost stories, the ilk that no one had dared publish before. The story which opens this collection is Strach w zameczku, Terror in the Castle, and for long this was the only short story that was republished. As I have said at the beginning, none of her stories were republished for over 200 years after the first publication. So in this story, Mostowska is playfully subverting gender-ascribed qualities and conviction of greater female susceptibility. Terror in the Castle is a first-person narrative by a female character who lives in a quiet village with her companions, Idalia and Edmond. Edmond often criticizes women for their numerous weaknesses, for being credulous and believing in the supernatural. But then he starts to be repeatedly visited by a ghost. At first, on every occasion, he is determined to find a rational explanation for the visitations. He is a skeptic who firmly claims that everything in the world has a natural physical cause. One must only make an effort to unearth it. But when the visitations of a woman in white intensify, Edmund finally surrenders and succumbs to these ghostly visitations. While his friends playfully tease him and remind him of his formal declarations that, quote, "Belief in every kind of prodigy is a mere fever of the mind," you said, Edmund. Edmund becomes more and more dejected, and as the narrator tells us, his overheated imagination made him believe that the ghost is that of a woman he once loved and lost prematurely. He became obsessed with the idea and soon started to long for the apparition, never decamped when it appeared, turning more melancholic after each encounter. Finally, watching Edmund's gradual physical decline, the women decide to reveal the truth about the apparition. But to their surprise, Edmund resolves to cling to the conviction that their intention is merely to spare him suffering. He indulges in the visitation and declares he is prepared to face the daily encounters with the ghost as befits his sex. The story ends when the company are visited by a priest who is determined to find natural reasons for the appearance of the ghost. He patiently examines the trees around, the soil underneath, looks for a possibility of optical illusions, evaporation, exhalation, which might have caused the undesirable physical effects. The priest vehemently dismisses the idea that the supernatural might be a soul of a deceased sent to make Edmund pray for the redemption of his or her sins. At this very moment, to the astonishment of the whole company, the apparition appears again. This time, however, they all notice a trap with a hinge and a cave underneath with Mary, Idalia's maid, inside. I suggest this quite simple ghost story. In this quite simple ghost story, Mostowska is addressing several important issues in her day. Firstly, she reveals here an understanding of the Gothic which departs from viewing it as a horrid and seriously subversive genre. For her, the essence of Gothic is to evoke emotions of terror, but this emotion can be the result of a practical joke. The supernatural is nothing more than a counterfeit. Terror is dispelled, emotional tension released, and everything wrapped up in the cathartic effect of comic relief. Theatrical supernatural tricks are clearly represented here as part and parcel of the leisure of the enlightened rich, and the experience of stage terror is seen as a lively and engaging diversion to dispel parlor boredom, but also teaches important lessons. Secondly, Mostowska was addressing in this story her predominantly Catholic readers. And on the one hand, this gives her an opportunity to advocate new enlightened type of priesthood, as if to oppose the facts, which were that the average clergyman in the territory of the former Poland-Lithuania was backward and narrow-minded and relished exploiting the supernatural as a tool of religious control, as a tool of religious threat to control his parishioners. Mostowska stresses in the story the priest's scientific rather than religious superstitious logic. In a detective-like manner, he digs the undergrowth in the spot where the ghost last appeared to unearth physical causes of the visitations. But on the other hand, she is also introducing the character of the priest to fulfill the didactic mission of the story and urges her Catholic readers to shake off centuries-long superstitions. For the Catholics, belief in purgatory was a strong theological doctrine. The imagination of both an ordinary believer and a representative of the church eagerly swooped into this intermediate territory. Priests treated the belief in the return of the dead as part of their pedagogy of fear, as I have said, and a means of exhorting indulgences and greater piety in their congregation. For their believers, supernatural signs of the return of their beloved ones was a way of maintaining an emotional link with them and an opportunity to contribute to their admittance to heaven. There is ample evidence in 18th century writing that everyday life of an ordinary person in the territory of Poland-Lithuania was saturated with the awareness of the other world. In her work, Magic and Astrology in the Literature of the Enlightenment, Danuta Kowalewska quotes diaries of an army general, Adam Oszczański, who in early 19th century noted that there was hardly a noble household in the countryside whose inhabitants would not believe that they were visited by the soul of their deceased relative, who returned demanding holy masses to secure redemption. There was even a word in Polish for these returning souls, powrotnik, a revenant, a returner. Especially in the northeastern territories of the former Poland-Lithuania where Mostowska lived, people still held on to their pagan beliefs and preserved various forms of old superstitions. Moreover, as has been said, by reversing the sex of the characters in the story, by making a man the victim of a joke, Mostowska strongly advocates a reformed viewing of conventional sex attributes. At the beginning of the story, its male protagonist, Edmund, attributes gullibility, susceptibility, garrulousness, and inability to keep secret to women. In a light-hearted manner, Mostowska combats these unjust, widely held convictions, disclosing to Edmund that for a few weeks, as many as 5 women were engaged in the preparation of the trick to which he fell prey. The character narrator thus concludes her story. Now, where is my pointer? Okay, souls in the purgatory. And this is actually an image from a late 19th century church of St. John the Baptist, which shows how strong the belief in the purgatory still was in the territories of Poland, Lithuania. So here we have the passage from the end of the story. Women or men, we all have the same virtues and vices. We have demonstrated not only to Edmund, but to all men that women can keep a secret, while men are just as prone to believing in ghosts as we are. When their imagination is aflame, they do not thoroughly investigate the matter, but are easily duped by apparitions. As we can see in this opening story, Mostowska is overtly didactic, and in her didacticism, openly proto-feministic, firmly urging for equality of the sexes. She toys with the idea of female weakness and incapacity, which were the very signs of leisure-class femininity. Her female characters are active and ingenious. In this story, Mostowska is cautious about the ontology of the supernatural. She dismisses it, but in the comments of her male character, she leaves a crevice. It is important. She leaves a crevice and she leaves the possibility of its existence open. It is important that it is a male voice who expresses belief in the supernatural and the possibility of its presence. Edmund says, "You ice-cold hearts cannot see what I see." But as Mostowska continued writing and publishing, she became bolder in her treatment of the supernatural and in voicing her egalitarian opinions. What is certainly the merit of her writing is that she captured a female tradition of oral storytelling, and many of her stories, as the one that we have just looked at, have female narrators, and often a narration is multi-layered to stress the long heritage of stories passed on by women. For example, in a story, Nie zawsze tak się czyni, jak się mówi, one doesn't always do as one preaches, she elevates the importance of female storytelling by adding a subtitle, a story told by a 100-year-old lady. In another one, Matylda and Daniło, the editor of the story presents to her readers a document allegedly retrieved from old archives, a device which can be seen as a nod to Walpole. But this document was, we read in the opening passages, was written by the story's fictional editor's great-grandmother, who in turn had heard the story from her grandmother. The grandmother had learned about it from her mother, who during her many journeys to her native Samogitia had heard it from the locals inhabiting the region where the events apparently happened. These two facts, first, that the story is filtered through so many female narrators, and two, that its frame editor admits to the difficulties in rewriting her grandmother's original script because, quote, she wrote very badly, as did many women in her times when very few were literate End of quote. So these two facts put emphasis on the matrilineal realm and draw our attention to the female perspective, to the importance of female generational bonds, to acknowledging the importance of and preserving and passing on stories concerning female experience. In this story, the main character learns that the ghost who haunts the neighborhood and lures her into the ruins of a castle is her own ancestor. The castle is massive, with a huge courtyard leading to a gigantic staircase, with intricate corridors, numerous chambers, labyrinthine underground passages, and inside it, the story's main character, Griselda, notices inscriptions in Old Germanic language, which her neighbor helps her translate. And then the ghost gives her a letter written in Polish, informing her that she is in direct line the 10th generation descendant of Edgwarda, whose ghost haunts her. 10 generations back from the story's frame narrator moves the action to roughly 14th, 15th century, and the presence of Old Germanic situates it in the times of the invasions of Teutonic Knights and Northern Crusades, the last crusades in the territory of Europe. From the letter, the main character learns that her ancestor, Edgwarda, was of a lower social background, that she married the owner of the castle and then brutally killed him and abandoned her own daughter. The inscriptions on the walls tell her that she was an exceptionally beautiful woman and that in her lifetime she turned the palace into, quote, a place of rancor and dissipation, where numerous knights fell prey to her charms and where she subjected them to heinous tortures and then brutally murdered them. The story has an important subtitle, a Samogitian story, and I just wanted to show to you where this territory of Samogitia is. It takes place in Samogitia, which for centuries was an ethnically distinct and administratively separate territory, later incorporated into Lithuania and into Poland, Lithuania. In medieval times, Samogitians were notorious for their warfare with the Teutonic Knights. Their resistance to foreign religion galvanized these people's adherence to local customs and beliefs. Samogitia was the last territory in Europe converted to Christianity in the early 15th century. Now, I suggest that what Mostowska does in this story by introducing the ghost of the pagan ancestor of her main character is that she gives voice to this female pagan character. It is, Matilda and Daniło is a thoroughly female-centered story of usurpation and transgression. In the character of Edgwarda, Mostowska unleashes the taboo side of femininity because Edgwarda not only transgresses the duties socially allocated to women, those of a devoted wife and mother, plus she is not a paragon of unblemished chastity. But this character also violates the conventional norms of morality when she murders her husband, neglects her daughter, and robs and then brutally kills a procession of Polish and German knights. In turning Edgwarda's home, which is the castle of her husband and not her ancestral possession, into the territory of crime marked by the blood of her victims, Mostowska problematizes the sanctity of the domestic realm associated with femininity. It is a realm which, though allocated to women, gives them no freedoms but confines them to its limits and enables men to subordinate them. When she makes her female character fully claim and possess the castle, Mostowska proposes a rather radical scenario. For Edgwarda, who was elevated by marriage into a higher social rank, moving to her husband's castle entailed not only assuming a new social role of a wife and a mother, but also a necessary conversion to Christianity and a compulsory adoption of a new social persona, which was something that she clearly could not and wouldn't do. The murderous spree in which she engaged can be read as her disagreement with or inability to assume the new identities. As a result, she subversively appropriated the territory culturally and politically allocated to women, in her case, her husband's castle, and transformed it into a territory of oppression, to which she lured her male victims and wreaks her feminine and pagan vengeance. Well, I hope I have demonstrated on the basis of these two short stories how, on the one hand, Mostowska started as a very cautious writer, very cautious in her use of the supernatural, and applied what can be termed as Radcliffean supernatural explained. At the same time, she consciously employed the supernatural to evoke fear, hoping that, as she stated in the preface to her first story, her readers bored with prescriptiveness and bluntness of earlier romances, will more eagerly turn to her stories in search of shocks and thrills. While supplying them with the desired pleasures, she hoped she could also fulfill her educational mission. An important part of this mission was the promotion of her feminist agenda, a new model of independent, self-reliant femininity. Her narratives are about women who do not swoon at the sight of a ghost. The feminist agenda in her stories is inextricably linked to a very specific political situation her native land found herself in. During the partition period, many families faced dispossessions. Many men were imprisoned, like her husband, or exiled because of their political involvement, like her brother-in-law. In the circumstances where in many households women were left on their own, it was vital for them to be active, to be empowered, self-reliant, but also it was vital to find support and confidence in contacts with each other. And it's this female network of connections, female energies that she elevated in her stories. Her supernatural is inextricably linked with the domestic perspective through which her ghost stories are narrated. The supernatural is woven into deeply superstitious domestic matrix. Women are seen engaging in folk rituals, as in one of her stories where she has female characters throw flowers on the bed of the newlywed couple to prophesy their future, in a ritual which involves also the burning of marjoram, myrtle, and rue, and then invoking God and the saints to ensure that they would never part. In most of her stories, Mostowska recreated an ontological order in which Christian doctrine competed with local superstitiousness and enlightened rationalism with folk beliefs. Brought up in Lithuania, where pagan rituals survived the longest, Mostowska left the door half open to the world of ghosts and magic, traditionally associated with women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnieska. That was amazing. I'm just trying to find the reaction button at the bottom of the screen here. Thank you so much. Some fascinating words and also some fascinating images as well. I'm sure there'll be lots of great questions, queries arising later. In the meantime, everyone feel free to use the chat function. Let's hear your words of approbation and let's have some thoughts there. We'll turn over now to our third and final speaker. Let me just pull up my notes here. Third speaker, oops, hang on, I just clicked on the wrong thing. Sorry. There we go. Our third speaker then, Dr. Kathleen Hudson, earned her postgraduate degree from the University of Sheffield in the UK. She is the author of Servants and the Gothic, 1764 to 1831, Half-Told Tale, and editor of the edited collection Women's Authorship and the Early Gothic, Legacies and Innovations, and has published widely on Gothic literature, class narratives, and women's writing. She currently works as an adjunct professor at the United States Naval Academy and Anne Arundel Community College. I'll hand over now to Kathleen.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here today. I want to begin first by saying thank you so much to the panel organizers. Thank you, Daniel, the panel chair, and to the entire Gothic Women team. I'm so pleased for this opportunity to be part of the Gothic Women Project, and it's very intimidating to come after those papers, although it's so wonderful because again, picking up on so many things that I would like to discuss in my paper as well. The Gothic Women Project is just such an amazing collaborative celebration of women's contributions to Gothic literature. And when I was planning this paper, I kept raising these interesting issues that I kind of want to echo, in honor of Halloween, in honor of the project. Namely, thinking about the premise of this when I was asked to speak here, they got me thinking about what can be gained from a continued examination of Gothic horror through a personal and critical lens. To put it another way, why do we keep telling each other ghost stories? Why celebrate Gothic women? What do we get out of tales that chill and thrill us? What does it say about us as human beings that stories that scare us are so important to the development of our individual and cultural consciousness, and that they, as the previous speakers have said, really emphasize these idea of female networks and giving voice to women and agency to women in new ways. So to ponder this question today, I wish to unpack a scene from Regina Maria Roche's Claremont, which was published in 1798 and is one of the Northanger novels Jane Austen's Catherine Morland found so horrid. So for those of us who are Northanger Abbey fans, in this scene I want to talk about, it's a break from the narrative proper, during which a series of inset ghost stories, and I am using the air quotes for ghost stories because in a minute I'm going to unpack how they aren't necessarily about ghosts, but they are ghost stories. And these horror tales are swapped between several women characters within the text on a dark and stormy night. And as they're doing this, the servant Agatha, who is one of the ones swapping these tales, comments that, quote, one story begets another, particularly if you can tell one to the same purpose of that we have been listening to. While Roche's Claremont and certainly the stories shared in this instance perhaps count as horrid, the character Agatha seems to note here that this is not all they are, and that in fact they have purpose and pedigrees and afterlives which undermine easy and dismissive readings. Gothic stories are also self-reflexive, didactic fables which illuminate moral codes of conduct as well as larger generic engagements. Servants Agatha and Floretta in Claremont, with heroine Madeline's approval, act out a creative exchange in this instance, which can be found throughout early Gothic literature, and which moreover speaks to a recognizable oral tradition dating back centuries. And again, Agnieska's comment on inherited stories and matrilineal stories in these female networks really does come into play here. Fully establishing that link, Roche even quotes Mark Akenside's poem, The Pleasures of the Imagination, published in 1744 in this chapter, where he describes, quote, the village matron round the blazing hearth, who suspends the infant audience with her tales, breathing astonishment of witching rhymes. Stories birth more stories, as Agatha comments, it seems, and according to both Akenside and Roche, such witching rhymes are often part of a self-sustaining, eminently productive, female-centric creative tradition. The exchange in question between Floretta and Agatha and Madeline occurs after Madeline has just witnessed a serious attack against her temporary guardian, the Countess de Merville. The Countess, moreover, has banned Madeline from attempting to discover her own family history and forced Madeline and the justice-seeking servant Agatha to swear to keep the attack against her a secret. The Countess, like many of her aristocratic class, reinforces patriarchal oppression, essentially buries her own narrative in the process. There we see again the recurring Gothic theme of silence as repression and narrative and agency for women, and indeed agency for working class women as well, in opposition to that. Unlike the Countess, indeed, servants in Claremont and the Gothic more generally rarely have such compulsions to repress narrative and enforce the patriarchal status quo, frequently offering or threatening to, quote, tell all I know, despite their employer's concerns. After a series of disturbing interludes, again, Gothic, very Gothic, disturbing interludes in the novel, a dejected Madeline eventually retreats to her rooms in the forbidding chateau in which she is staying, and there Agatha and Floretta elect to keep her company. Eager to entertain themselves, what follows then in the next chapter is an exchange of ghost stories between Agatha and Floretta, in which both women emerge as authors in the text, orally repeating and rewriting stories for their own pleasure and for that of their audience, Madeline. They just deconstruct their narratives and Madeline's reactions within the text by reassigning ancient, and I, again, scare quote that because that would be how they would be referred to in the novel, ancient modes of identity, again, that of Akenside's matron, storyteller, and infant audience, to the participants. They even set the scene as a Gothicized space. Agatha comments, quote, how mournfully the wind howls, suggesting that their current situation puts her in mind of, quote, the night before my lord, the Count de Merville, died. A thought which leads in a moment to a discussion of a haunted suit of armor in the castle, which historically falls whenever there is a change about to take place in the family. The suit of armor's value as a supernatural artifact is quickly dismissed by Madeline, despite the, quote, involuntary horrors Agatha's words inspire in her. But this short tale then forms the basis for continued conversation as stories beget more stories. And Floretta, the other servant who's present at the time, then dives into her own tale of inanimate objects acting to reveal hidden sins. In her story, a castle wall is being renovated by a group of villagers, and during construction, a skeleton falls out of the brickwork and lands in front of a passing stranger. Again, the kind of stories you would only get from a Gothic novel. Obviously shaken, the stranger immediately confesses to murder, noting that it is, quote, a dreadful mistake to think any could be enjoyed from a fortune whose foundation was laid in blood. Floretta, for her part, says that an evil conscience has often occasioned the discovery of foul crimes. Notably, she does not credit a supernatural intervention, which is a rarity for servant narrators in the Gothic. More often than not, they're inclined to believe in supernatural explanations. But she does not necessarily credit it in this point, but rather states that, quote, the stranger imagined the falling of the skeleton ordered by heaven. Hard tropes such as accusing skeletons are thus given value, but only as objects in and of themselves and firmly within the context of moral correction and psychological and emotional reactivity. Within the self-reflexive space, so Floretta finishes her story, and then Agatha then takes the opportunity to tell her own tale, which also potentially upends the stability of the Gothic subjects, shifting her focus away from traditional aristocratic heroes and supernatural phenomena and towards Peter, an old servant to an aristocratic family. When the master of the house dies abroad under mysterious circumstances, his estate is then occupied by a distant relative who promptly dispossesses the remaining widow and child. Peter, as a servant, has no legal or social standing to contradict the new owner's claims, and yet keeping an eye on his new master and the, quote, involuntary horrors he sometimes portrayed, Peter eventually, quote, drew an inference that shocked him. Determined to know whether it was or was not a just one, he devised a scheme which, when you hear it, you will say was a bold one. And that's Agatha commenting on the bold one. Peter suspects what the habitual Gothic reader will immediately recognize as a common generic plot twist. No one ever dies naturally in a Gothic novel. The plot twist that the new master is metaphorically haunted by a past sin, in this case, the murder of his predecessor. In response to these suppositions on the part of the Gothic servant, Peter tells his new employer of a dream he allegedly had, in which his deceased ex-master promised to implicate his murderer, either through the interference of a ghost or in the physical manifestation of the perpetrator's guilty conscience. Immediately after Peter describes the dream, his new master is taken ill, and a flash of light from an old tower indicates allegedly supernatural activity. The guilty party has thus been unmasked, and Peter, his suspicions confirmed, demands that his employer give up his ill-gotten gains. Morality is affirmed and all return to their respective roles within the social and moral hierarchy. However, the story is not quite as straightforward as a ghost interrupts and then solves the entire thing. Agatha defends the legitimacy of her tale after the fact by adding that, quote, this story was divulged by the servant whose assistance Peter had obtained for carrying into execution the scheme he had contrived, suggesting that Peter was, in fact, significantly more proactive in achieving his desired ends than first implied. This process of narrative rewriting by a Gothic subject renders the master character a textual body, while the servant character becomes the corresponding discerning reader. Peter, having read and interpreted his inference of the master, correctly, then assumes an active role as author in constructing a narrative which, through its performance, facilitates revelation and real-world change, i.e., by using a fellow servant to act as a ghost, flash a light in a tower which Peter has exclusive access to. He even admits to being the only one to have the key to that particular tower, and thus inspire a guilty reaction in his master. As such, participant in the Gothic story and Gothic subject thus becomes a creative author. The results of this exchange of ghost stories within a larger ghost story, within a larger Gothic novel, are twofold within the text. So the first goal is pretty straightforward. It's to impart a moral lesson, which runs through the short stories and the novel proper. Like the characters in Agatha and Floretta's stories, Madeline's father, so the heroine's father, is on the run from his past. And like all such Gothicized sins, this one will eventually come back to haunt him and Madeline. Madeline herself makes the connection between naturally occurring terrors and, quote, the horrors these excite in one burthened with guilt. However, more than just reflecting the plot of the novel, this exchange also offers an interesting commentary on the roles of readers and authors within generic negotiations of the Gothic. And it does it by giving, the voice and agency and autonomy to a group of women who are historically working class and socially marginalized, socially vulnerable figures. These stories are shared partially to provide solace and comfort for both author and audience during a threatening storm, and immediately after a period of violent upheaval during which a woman is attacked and narrative is repressed. It is no accident that the brightness and warmth of a cheerful fire in the room are described as an uplifting contrast to the chaos and darkness outside, or that when the tension becomes overwhelming, the women take a break from telling stories, have a nap, and even mull wine and make toast, stating that, quote, it will do us all good, as if truly there is nothing more emotionally and psychologically beneficial to anyone than a story and a snack. The categorization of Gothic storytelling as a constructive, comforting, community-building activity justifies participation in the creative literary exchange, not just for servant storytellers, although I think it is very important that class and economic status are essentially blurred here, but also for women writers of the Gothic more broadly. That the pattern of terror, delays, comfort, and moral truth-saying furthermore contributes to enjoyment and tension within the text, extends that generic engagement then even further, is perhaps a very self-conscious choice that minimal supernatural interference is cited or accepted in any of Agatha or Floretta's stories, placing them on par with lauded authors such as Anne Radcliffe and Roche herself, both of whom famously eschewed supernatural explanations in their own plots. That the stories are also effective as terror tales is also established. Madeline leaves the chamber full of the spirit of superstition inspired by the stories. And in a classic Gothic heroine moment, she experiences an emotional extreme which manifests in a fainting fit when Madeline soon thereafter misidentifies a known character for a spectral intruder. Bless her. As ever, the heroine must learn to balance her emotional sensitivity with rational courage within a space defined by bodily threats and patriarchal oppression. But this pattern of storytelling within the story does add that extra element to it, in which she has a new kind of realm in which to participate. In Madeline's reactions and in the structure of the stories themselves, we also see an interesting moment of self-placement within the fictional story, as well as the consciousness that we, the audience, are reading a ghost story within a ghost story, blurring the lines between Gothic subjects. Just as Peter's master becomes a textual body within Peter's attempt to reconstruct reality, so too do Agatha, Floretta, and Madeline invite deeper readings as the heroine and servants and authors and audience of a Gothic novel. And so too are we as an audience in turn invited to examine our own placement as readers. Us reading Madeline, reading Agatha, reading Peter makes for a nesting doll narrative and offers close examination of processes of active and creative participation, the generic boundaries of the Gothic, the emotional effect of terror, and the complex power ghost stories have to shape moral and social identity, both within the text and within our own lives. That people in general and women in particular share Gothic tales is apparently an acknowledged fact. Hannah More once derisively identified Gothic fiction as, quote, "this species of composition that every raw girl while she reads is tempted to fancy that she can also write." Moore's attitude notwithstanding, she's not wrong. This species has a complicated genetic structure, a pattern of inheritance and networking and interconnectivity and shared creative potential, which reflects the external as well as internal drives to give voice to the vulnerable and marginalized, to give agency to women and to working class figures, and to redefine the usual ties that bind us. As moral lessons, cultural objects, moments of community and comfort, as what a proto version of what Wes Craven identified as a kind of, quote, boot camp for the psyche. Such stories are critical reflections and important artifacts, particularly when focusing on this idea of women's Gothic writing. And speaking as to the question I started out with, why we have a continued interest in tales of terror, why we're all here today, Floretta gives her own answer. There is nothing I think can delight people more than hearing stories, particularly on a winter's night. As we eagerly consume tales of the macabre and fantastic, we are participating in an exchange Roach masterfully explores. And we all might as well be Catherine Morland asking with eager relish, but are they all horrid? Are you sure they are all horrid? All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathleen. What a great way to round off the panel there. So some great questions and comments. And thank you to all of our speakers for impeccable timekeeping. That gives us plenty of time for questions, queries. Oh, and I forgot to do the reactions at the bottom and clappy gesture here. Before I forget, I'm just going to pop a comment to the chat. Someone mentioned earlier Catherine Crowe. For those of you who don't know, Catherine Crowe, Romantic period author, she was known as a ghost fancier, which I think would make a great title for a business card or something. The University of Kent happens to have her archives. It's worth having a look to that. Anyway, I'm going to shut up. I want to hear from everyone else. So let's hear questions, queries. I think some questions did come into the chat earlier. I'll trawl through those. But let's turn straight over to questions. At this stage, just checking our three speakers have their cameras on. Fantastic, good. And we also have cameras on for the Gothic Women Committee as well. So who wants to kick us off with any questions, queries? Feel free to use the chat function. Also, there is the hand raising gesture. So a question has come in here, which I'll read out if that's okay. Question, are there any Gothic stories written by women of colour? I think that's a question for anyone on the panel.
Yes.
Go for it, Lauren.
I think we will be putting it up soon, but you might be interested in the work of our speaker from last time, Mostowska. So just before our speaker's answer, just to let you all know, that will be being published on the YouTube very shortly. So do keep an eye out for that. If whoever asked that question, I think you'll be very interested in that one.
Yeah, and just to add in there, some of the texts that we taught on our Gothic courses are by 19th century women writers called Hannah Crafts, who wrote the Bondwoman's Narrative. That's a really interesting 19th century text by an African-American woman who Maisha has written about in really interesting ways. So that's a good one to look at. But if you get hold of Maisha's work, then she'll direct you to lots of other interesting sources and kind of ways in which some of what we're talking about in relation to that figure of the female ghost is used really interestingly by Hannah Crafts. So the kind of the female slave returning as a kind of cursed figure. So I think certainly Toni Morrison does qualify, as people are saying in the chat, but she's also building on some of those 19th century slave narratives, which have these kind of Gothic elements and sort of draw on lots of different traditions of ghosts from around the world.
Thank you, Emma. That's really helpful. Thank you for those suggestions. We had a question earlier from Alistair Dunn. And Alistair, I think you had a hand raised as well. If you want to come in, Alistair. If not, I can read your question out for you from earlier. Are you still here, Alistair?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Perfectly. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank all the speakers. It's been fascinating stuff. I'd like to make a comment, really, rather than a question concerning Emma's talk, and that's Lettice Galbraith. So, am I permitted to share a screen? Okay. So, that is Lettice Galbraith.
Wow.
I should say that Emma mentioned the surname Gibson in relation to Lettice Galbraith, and I think that probably comes from me rather than Richard Golby.
Okay.
So her real name was Lizzie Susan Gibson. She was christened Lizzie, not Elizabeth. I believe she hated the name so much that she transmogrified it into Letty, and she was known as Letty, and therefore in her writing called herself Lettice by expanding that into Lettice. She was born in 1859, died in 1932. I'm not going to say a huge amount to her because this isn't published yet, and I only got this photograph about 2 weeks ago, and it's taken me 3 years to get this far. So,
Wow.
I'd be happy to share some more details with Emma if you like. I guess the admins could probably give you my email address if you wanted to get in touch.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Alistair, if you could email the Gothic Women email address with your details, then I'll make sure that gets to Emma.
Sure, I'll do that. No problem at all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alistair. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that photograph. That's amazing. Definitely worth that hunting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alistair. That's really helpful. I just want to share with people that when Alistair put about this in the chat, I had this horrible feeling that Lettice was going to turn out to be a man, and that everyone knew apart from me. So that would have ruined my whole paper. But thankfully not. So that's great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Some more questions have come into the chat, but my chat bar is going haywire. I'm trying to. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I think there was a question from Isabella Barone. If you want to come in, Isabella, if not, I'm happy to read out the question for you.
Yes, it was just a general question to all the speakers about what writing do you think affected you the most and drew you to the genre of Gothic literature? That was it.
Oh, that's a tough one.
For me
just
too.
One. Yes, to pick just one. Gosh. I mean,
or maybe the most memorable.
Susan Hill, I hate to be cliched, but The Woman in Black scared me. Turn the Screw scared me. Probably in terms of professionally working in the Gothic, it would have to be Anne Radcliffe. That feels like a very cliched answer, but I didn't really come to the Gothic and my area of Gothic until I was doing my PhD, and we read Anne Radcliffe for the not that I didn't have my issues with Anne Radcliffe at the time, because we were reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is not a short book, and which is not lacking in long descriptions of landscapes and everything, but parts of it were just so striking and terrifying and important. I thought it, so yeah, probably Radcliffe, I would have to say, for me.
Shall I go?
Please.
Shall I go next? I'm just racking my brains trying to choose where to start. It's really hard to answer. I love Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca from 1938, which is building on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So I just really like that sort of set of narratives that look back to Jane Eyre as a Gothic story, I think, because I've always been fascinated by haunted houses. So just texts that have these dark interiors with hidden secrets. That's something that I really like. Du Maurier wrote some really great ghost stories as well, like shorter form. So her story that the film Don't Look Now is based on is a really creepy one set in Venice. So kind of anything that's set in Venice is also something that I really like, kind of Italian Gothic.
Anyone else on the committee?
Yeah, the question was about the first horror stories that inspired our interest in the Gothic in general. Well, for me, it was during my MA seminar when I read Surprise, Surprise and Radcliffe and Matthew Gregory Lewis. This was the one that really, shocked me. A very humble and well-behaved Catholic girl from behind the Iron Curtain. This was a real eye-opener for me. And also Sheridan Le Fanu's ghost stories. I really liked In a Glass Darkly. This was something really interesting for me. So this was really my initiation, and I wrote my MA on Sheridan Le Fanu. But yeah,
Wonderful.
Lewis definitely.
Wonderful, thank you. Great. I'm not seeing any hand. Oh, I do see a hand raised actually.
We've also got a question in the chat from Jung Kyung Kim.
Yes, we'll begin with the question from Yong Kae-yong Kim, and then we'll turn to Ray Belotti, if that's okay. Yong Kae-yong, I'm not sure if you're still here. I'm happy to read out the question for you. Oh, fantastic. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts on and the question. So first of all, it was so a wonderful talk, everyone. Thanks so much. So I'm thinking about how can we interpret or read women's ghost stories in the context of a non-gender binary circumstance. Because when I started to study on Gothic literature, I would think about very traditional, conventional way. I was trying to compare some distinctive characteristics evident in women's ghost stories to those of so-called male ghost stories. But the more I learn about the women's ghost stories, I have to ask myself, how can I situate British 19th century women's ghost stories in the 20th century or 21st century queer studies? So I want to hear about your thoughts on this aspect. That's my question.
I can start if you like. That one of the writers that I've done some research on is Vernon Lee, that people may know about, who's another 1890s writer. Have you heard of her? Who writes stories like A Wicked Voice that I was teaching with my students only recently, and you can certainly read some of the kind of the ghostly presences in that story in terms of the breakdown of gender binaries, of ghosts being kind of neither male nor female or somewhere in between. It's a story organized around a voice, the ghostly voice of a male castrato singer, and Lee as a lesbian writer is trying to break down some of those binary oppositions, I think, certainly in that story, and I think it's something that 20th century 21st century writers of ghost stories certainly try to build on. But I know less about that. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in with anything.
I can chip in. It's so interesting. When I was doing my PhD, they did subdivide quite a few of the early Gothic texts into male Gothic and female Gothic. Although there were plenty of female Gothic writers in the male and vice versa, to the point where having since left that binary behind a little bit, I've sort of tried to let it go a bit, this distinction, because I'm not sure that the definitions of male Gothic and female Gothic really work. Along the same lines, I mean, they used to basically subdivide that then as female Gothic is terror Gothic, because it doesn't show all the horrific things that are happening, whereas male Gothic is horror Gothic because it has all the gross stuff and the sex and all the that part. But again, it's not. I think we make a mistake as critics by making the distinction between terror and horror Gothic, because you really can't have terror without horror, without the threat of horror, and you really can't have horror without the buildup of terror. So making the distinction as if the two novels don't have any interlinked terror horror dynamics is, I think, probably limiting us significantly. And also, again, dividing it but down the line of female and male Gothic, I think too, then makes certain kinds of texts less readable. You know, oh, I don't want to do that because it's a female Gothic, or this is in the wrong category. I think if you want to, again, explore the binary, I think you have to look at the author specifically, but you also need to look at, I think, again, from all of the papers that were given today, the treatment of women within the text. You have to look at how the Gothic is utilized to give voice to the voiceless, to give agency to women, to articulate female specific issues like repression, like imprisonment, silencing. That's, I think, where the future of trying to delineate some of these Gothic texts really needs to lie. So all the critics can now come after me, the ones who've written very wonderful stuff about women's Gothic and male Gothic and horror and terror Gothic, but I do wonder if those terms haven't run their course a bit.
Yes, excellently put, Kathleen. And also, if we look at the writing of the author who is actually, held responsible for contributing to these binaries between terror and horror, if you have a look at some specific examples from, for example, The Mistress of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, I mean, it is full of scenes of domestic horror. I wouldn't call it terror when Montoni throws Emily onto the floor, rips part of her clothes, and, she is flooded with blood and he's got blood on his hands. This is domestic abuse, and this is pure horror for me. Yes, as you were saying, it is also allowing the repressed, allowing the marginalized, allowing those voices who have not been heard before, and also this distinction that male horror is necessarily written by men and female horror written by women is not true. And even in the writing of the author that I was talking about, Mostowska, who knew nothing about these distinctions. She actually has, being a female writer, yes, she has a female character who is capable of grossly horror. So we should be very, very cautious when applying these distinctions.
Thank you.
I'm just popping in the chat there, notice of Walter Sholto Douglas, trans male Scottish author from the Romantic period. I'm doing a bit of work on him, just such an inventive short story writer, poet, dramatist, perhaps best known to Mary Shelley scholars. Mary Shelley helped Douglas, also known as David Lindsay, to move to France to live with his wife. Any other comments there about that question? Really, really good question, really thoughtful question. If not, we'll turn to Ray. Ray, you've got your hand raised there, very politely waiting. Did you want to come in at this point, please?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Awesome, thanks. Kathleen, my question's kind of more for you. I was super fascinated by your perspective on this sort of working class element in horror that's so rarely there. So many horror stories from this era are just primarily from the perspective of the, sort of upper class. And when the working class do tend to appear, they tend to be sort of demonized. They're usually criminals or scary people in inns or whatever. So I guess my question is sort of like, do you find that when this sort of like in the story you mentioned where the servant reveals the villain to be the rich guy who's sort of, getting his inheritance, do you find that appearances of the working class is like in heroic roles is more subversive in horror from that era, or is it not that simple, really? I was kind of curious about that.
I actually think that I think we retroactively tend to apply a little bit of a Victorian view of class, not incorrectly, on the late 18th century. In fact, for most of these texts, from Walpole to Radcliffe to Roche, servants are heroic characters to a certain extent. I mean, they are key. They are included. They are constantly giving information. They're constantly looking out for the heroine. Usually when the heroine has managed to, well, first off, they help the heroine escape the Gothic space almost every time. You know, they could not get out of that Gothic space if the servant wasn't like, oh, hey, I found a passage, let's get out of here. You know, there's that famous instance in Udolpho where the maidservant Annette, who is this silly comical character up until that point, essentially saves Emily's mind. Emily is on the cusp of madness, but it says, you know, Annette stayed with her throughout the night and basically kept her safe that whole time. Servants comment in a very detailed way about the moral foibles and peccadilloes of their upper class characters. They famously call out the villains of the piece as being amoral, and when they have determined that their employers are not moral enough to suit them, they pretty much pack up and leave and take the heroine with them. But it is very interesting. I will say that Roche is taking this is I won't say it's a unique instance, but it is a very rare instance in which a servant is telling a story. That's not unique. Servants are always telling stories in Gothic text, but it's interesting that it's a servant telling a story about a servant who is the main character. You know, it's the author telling about another author, and I just thought it was a very meta moment of like, yeah, I am a servant in a Gothic text. Let me tell you about another servant in another Gothic story who not only participated but actually made up a ghost story, you know, made up a thing, set out, put his friend in a tower, had him flash the light at the right time. You know, it was basically like Quentin Tarantinoing his own performance. It's not, I think servants are marginalized significantly later in the 19th century. But in the early Gothic, they are 110%, if not equals. They're not equals, but they have their place and they have their structure. You almost cannot have a Gothic novel without them. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was just, would you characterize that as a questioning of like class structure or sort of classism, or would that be a stretch perhaps?
I think it would probably be more a reaction to the emergence of a middle class, and also a sensibility, I think. I mean, this is around the French Revolution, and I think aristocrats are kind of sort of pseudo-aware that they exist because there are people in a class below them who are kind of looking out for them a little bit.
I see.
You know, and I mean, many of the authors are middle class women writing this, or middle class in some way. I mean, Horace Walpole's an exception, obviously, but they are, you know, it's a challenge to aristocratic superiority that you have a servant who walks in and is just like, can say whatever they want and challenge all this moral stuff. And no, I do think it is subversive in that servants actively challenge patriarchy. They actively challenge the assumption that there's, just because you're an aristocrat and you employ them, that means you control what they say and what they think and their moral understanding of you, because you can't. They really do resist that very much. But by the end of most of the novels, everything is fixed, everything is happy. They have attached themselves to a very moral middle class person, and you know, everything sort of realigns itself. So is it subversive? Yeah, but it usually seems to end then on a nice, neat little, and then they all lived happily ever after thing. So there's a limit to it.
That's super fascinating. Thank you so much. It really answers my question.
Yes.
Great question. Thank you so much. I'm just mindful of the fact that Kathleen's got to head off for class very soon. So do we have any specific queries for Kathleen before we lose her, and before we raise any further queries? And I was certainly fascinated with the idea of ghost stories within the stories, and it's just something just fascinating about the way the book is structured. It just seems so unique in many ways. I'm always always slightly cautious about saying that, because I wonder if it is part of a larger pattern, or is it something that she's developed elsewhere? She's an author I don't know very well, for example.
Yeah, well, it's yeah, I'm not sure about Roche, but again, most Gothic novels do include inset Gothic tales and inset ghost stories. So, you know, the servant will say, oh, I know everything there is to know about this castle or this haunted portrait or this person who disappeared. Let me tell you. So that is very common. And I do think it is a weirdly little meta moment in which authors, and particularly women authors who maybe don't have as many writing communities as men do to get feedback from, are sort of, you know, trying to negotiate their own identity a little bit. You know, they're like, well, I'm a woman, I'm going to include women authors, I'm going to include creative women in my writing, and I'm going to try to sound out maybe my literary heritage and where I come from, and how is this effective, and how does this work. I do get the sense a little bit in recurring for women writers of the Gothic that they do use servants as a way to parse that a little bit.
That's really interesting. That's really helpful. Thank you. That really helps things.
I'm actually, unless there's another question, I'm going to have to go. So I wanted to say thank you so much for having me on. And I would love to stay for the rest of the discussion, but I'm going to have to head out now. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Enjoy class. Have a great class.
Right. Thank you. Bye.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we've got a question from Andy Meek. Well, a couple of questions actually, Andy. Andy, I'm not sure if you're still here. You want to raise those? If not, I'll happily verbalize them for you. That's Andy Meek. Andy, if not, I'll happily read them out for you. Let's ask both questions, I think. So I'm just going to read out Andy's comment in the chat here. In 19th century Poland, was there a local equivalent of the penny dreadful? So we're talking about genre. It'd be quite good to hear about form, actually, I think. That's a great question. And the second question is a more general one. It seems that comics and graphic novels, including those which focus on horror, are dominated by men. Just trying to read the bottom of the screen. Cliffhanger. Just want to read the bottom of it. Oops. Sorry, my screen's playing up. Comics and graphic novels, including those which focus on horror, gothic, are dominated by men, both the writers and for the art. But am I right in thinking that in the 19th century, women contributed, sorry, I lost the bit again, contributed more to penny dreadfuls than seems to be the case with the form's contemporary descendant, the comic graphic novel. If women were significantly, cliffhanger again, involved in penny dreadfuls, what do you think led to the marginalization when it comes to writing and illustrating the Gothic in the comic form? So we're talking about form, basically, and penny dreadfuls in particular, in the Polish context, but also I think more broadly as well. And it's a great question about authorship and artistry, who produces those materials. So Agnieska, I'm not sure if we want to begin with you because we explicitly said Poland, but then we'll open up to the panel.
Yes, that is a great question. Thank you very much. Well, the problem is that we cannot really find any equivalents, direct equivalents of penny dreadfuls in Poland at that time. And the reason being, first of all, political. At the time when penny dreadfuls were written and published in England, that is in the early decades and decades of 19th century, mid-19th century, Poland really was going through extremely devastating political turmoil. And so most of the literature that was written at that time, Polish romantics, especially romanticism in Poland, started in the 1820s, was really focused on local matters and was really focused on, reviving great Poland's past, and focused on elements of folklore and local law. So perhaps in this sense, and because the work of Romantics was initially really very much disparaged, and critics didn't really approve of Mickiewicz, the Polish Byron. So perhaps in this sense of having literature that is full of shocking images, right? So perhaps the shocking ingredient of Penny Dreadfuls can be found in some of the works of Polish Romantics. But interestingly, when I was investigating Anna Mostowska, who, as I said, her work was not republished since it first emerged in the first decade of the 19th century. But the story that I was talking about, Terror in the Castle, was actually put on stage in the 1820s, and it was considered, an interesting shocker, because actually Mostowska had quite a lot of interesting theatrical devices inserted into the story that I didn't talk about. So it was considered then an interesting chilling shocker. And also later critics of the 20th century until the 1960s, really, whenever they discussed Mostowska's writing, they would always compare her to Penny Dreadfuls, to chilling shockers in England. So that would be my answer. But a direct, replica, the answer is no. No, we didn't.
Great, thank you. So Lauren shared in the chat there some links to sorry, I've lost the chat bar again, it keeps disappearing, to some indie comics produced by women and female creative teams. So that's great. Thank you for that Lauren. I'll look forward to looking at that myself, actually. Any other thoughts from the committee related to Andy's question, or any further? We'll begin to wrap up fairly soon. We've done a great job in grilling our speakers, and some really helpful links have developed out of this, actually, which I find really, really interesting, really useful. I hope you have as well. And further links there from Lauren. Deborah Russell.
I had a question, if that's okay, for Emma. I was thinking about, if this is kind of something, it's a slightly selfish question because it's something I'm interested in anyway, but I was thinking about the power of silence kind of in and of itself. So as well as those ideas about kind of being silenced and wanting your story to be told, but it seems that there's something striking in the ghosty figure returning and commanding others' silence, and it being effective when nothing is actually said, or the woman who withholds her identity. So yeah, I was just wondering if I could get you to say more about the power of silence.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thanks, Deborah. And there's lots of different ways to think about silencing, I suppose, aren't there? And that we do think about it negatively often in lots of ways. I think it's Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick who talks about silence as being a speech act, so making the decision not to speak or using your silence in a slightly different way can be sort of important, I guess, in the ghost story that I look at. That we've been hearing a lot tonight about the importance of telling stories, as well as women telling their stories within the Gothic, as well as women writing these Gothic stories. But within some of the stories, just women appearing, sometimes that their bodies can tell these stories if they appear in the text. So there's an interesting thing that I didn't really get time to talk about in the seance room story that I've been working on, that we're told that the doctor, the murderous doctor, hears the word murderer, but we don't know whether, and he doesn't know whether the ghost says that word or whether he hallucinates it, or whether it's just a word that's sort of circulating in the story. And I find that quite interesting, about who is in control of the stories and so on. But sometimes it's just these women appear, you know, a bit like the woman in black does. We've mentioned her quite a lot. She just appears in graveyards. She doesn't say anything always, and that appearance then becomes a specific transgressive act of agency, maybe. So, you know, what people say or don't say can be really significant. I don't know if that's helpful or not, Deborah.
It's certainly a very terrifying aspect of any sort of horror movie or terror movie. The silence, I find. It's the anticipation, of course. So terrifying. Great. I think a great question came in from Carolina, sorry. Are there any other forgotten Polish women or Eastern European, I guess, more broadly? Any thoughts about that? Agnieska.
Okay, thank you very much. That's an interesting question. Yes, there are actually. And the place to look for would be periodicals. Quite a lot has been published in Vilnius at the time when Mostowska was writing. This was really a very vibrant publishing center. You know, Warsaw at the time was on the fringes of the Prussian Empire. It really became in the early 19th century, in the first decade of the 19th century, an insignificant town. So as I said, everybody, all the intellectuals and the publishing houses moved to Vilnius in the early decade, in the first decade of the 19th century. And actually they did have quite a vibrant university community and also a publishing center. So the local press, I think it was Vilnius Weekly, actually did publish quite a lot of short stories, some of which were ghost stories by various female writers. So this would be an interesting area of exploration, and actually an area that has not been thoroughly investigated. So yes.
Fascinating. I think that might be a great place to wrap up, actually, the anticipation of further discovery, further work. 29th of November, pop it in your diaries. That will be our next event, which is Radcliffe Beyond Udolpho. And Lauren has shared the link already. The Eventbrite, and as with tonight, it's a free event. Please circulate that nice and widely. It's great to see so many people from all over the world joining us at these events. We want to sort of get the word out there, so do spread the word of mouth. And what a wonderful evening it's been for us, early in the day, later in the evening, some of you, depending where you are. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And just on behalf of the rest of the committee who might want to say something as well, just thank you to the speakers for 3 amazing pitch perfect papers, and questions and answers very much on point, really useful. I'm going to shut up, but if anyone wants to say anything, great. If not, we'll have a great Halloween week. What a great start to Halloween week, of course. Thank you for coming, everyone.